Traditional and Critical Theory, 1937, by Horkheimer. The problem? What is theory? Seems, under the condition of science today, to pose no great difficulty in ordinary research. Theory is understood as the summation of propositions about a certain subject area, propositions interconnected in such a way that some can be used to derive others. The fewer the number of fundamental principles with respect to the consequences derived from them, the more perfect the theory. The real validity of the theory consists in the fact that derived propositions correspond with factual events. When, however, contradictions arise between experience and theory, either one or the other must be revised accordingly. Either the fault lies in one's observation, or something is out of order with the theoretical principles. In relation to the facts, therefore, theory remains a mere hypothesis. One must be ready to modify the theory whenever incompatibilities arise in the handling of materials. Theory is knowledge stockpiled in a form that renders it useful for the most precise characterization of the facts. Henry Poincaré compares science to a library that should grow without end. Experimental physics plays the role of librarian, seeing to new acquisitions for the collection that is the enrichment of knowledge through the acquisition of new materials. Mathematical physics, which constitutes the theory of natural science in the strictest sense, has the task of producing the catalogue. In the absence of this catalogue, the library, despite all its riches, could not be used. This is also the rule of mathematical physics. It must guide scientific generalization in order to increase its effective utility. The goal of theory in general appears in the universal system of science, and the theory is no longer limited to a particular field, but encompasses all possible objects of scientific inquiry. The separation of the sciences is to be abolished by referring all propositions from various fields of scientific inquiry back to the same presuppositions. One and the same conceptual apparatus is to serve the determination of inanimate nature and the classification of living beings, and once it has been learned, viz. The rules of deduction, the inventory of signs, the procedures for the comparison of deduced propositions is established facts, etc. It can be used at any time. Only we are still far from reaching this goal. This, in broad outline, is the prevailing representation of the essence of theory in science today. This tendency goes back to the beginnings of modern philosophy. Descartes characterizes the third maxim of his scientific method as the decision to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. The kind of derivation characteristic of mathematics is to be applied to all of science. The order of the world is to be unlocked through a deductive nexus in thought. Those long chains of utterly simple and easy reasonings that geometers commonly use to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations had given me occasion to imagine that all the things that can fall within human knowledge follow from one another in the same way, and that, provided only that one abstain from accepting any of them as true, that is not true, and that one always adheres to the order one must follow in deducing the ones from the others. There cannot be any that are so remote that they are not eventually reached, nor so hidden that they are not discovered. According to the philosophical disposition of the logician, the most general propositions that are to serve as the point of departure for the deduction can either be considered judgments of experience or inductions, as in the case of John Stuart Mill, or as self-evident insights, as in the case of the rationalistic and phenomenological currents, or as arbitrary stipulations, as in the case of modern-day axiomatics. In the most advanced logical system of the present, such as in Husserl's logical investigations, this idea has found its representative expression in the characterization of theory as a self-enclosed system of propositions of science as such. Theory, in the most pregnant sense, is a systematic interconnection of propositions in the form of a systematically unified deduction. Science itself is defined as a certain universe of propositions, as always arises out of theoretical labor and in which systematic order a certain universe of objects comes to determination. The basic demand every theoretical system must satisfy is that all of its parts stand in continuous and non-contradictory connection with one another. In addition to the absence of any superfluous dogmatic components which are without influence on observable phenomena, Henry Whale characterizes the indispensable conditions of science as one of unanimity or the absence of contradiction. To the extent that the traditional concept of theory exhibits any tendency, its tendency lies in direction of a purely mathematical system of science, in which increasingly fewer names for objects of experience are to function as elements of the theory, as parts of conclusions and propositions, relative to an increasingly preponderance of mathematical symbols. Even logical operations themselves have already been rationalized to the extent that theory formations has become a matter of mathematical construction in large sectors of natural sciences. The sciences of man and society attempt to model themselves on the successful natural sciences. The distinction between those schools of the science of society oriented more towards factual research on the one hand, and those schools oriented more towards theoretical principles on the other, has nothing to do with the concept of theory as such. The industrious collection of data in all fields concerned with understanding life, the compilation of tremendous quantities of details for each problem, the empirical research conducted through the increasingly precise survey or other aids, which, since Spencer, has constituted a greater part of the activity of the social sciences in Anglo-Saxon universities, in particular, certainly offers an image which on the surface is more closely related to everyday life under the industrial mode of production than the formulation of more abstract principles, and the writing does discourse on basic concepts that were characteristic of a kind of German sociology. And yet this does not signify a structural distinction in thought. In the late hours of present-day society, the so-called human sciences only have, at any rate, a rather unstable market value. They must, schelt und direkt, approximate the more successful natural sciences, whose utility is beyond question. In any case, there can be no doubt concerning the identity of the conception of theory across the diverse schools of sociology, nor of the identity between this conception and that of natural sciences. Under present circumstances, the empiricists have no different representation of what a fully developed theory is than the theoreticians do. The former are merely the self-conscious conviction that, given the complexity of social problems and the current level of social sciences, any work that involves the elaboration of general principles is rather idle pursuit. To the extent there is theoretical work to be carried out, it should be conducted through continuous engagement in specific material. Comprehensive theoretical presentations are at any rate hardly even thinkable in the foreseeable future. The method of exact formulation, particularly those of more mathematical procedures, whose significance is intimately tied to the concept of theory outlined above, enjoy widespread popularity among these scholars. It is not so much the significance of theory as such, but of theory from above, of theory produced by those who lack any real engagement with the problems of an empirical special science that is contested. Distinction, such as those between the Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, Taunis, medical and organic solidarity, Durkheim, culture and civilization, Weber, as basic forms of human socialization, immediately prove to be problematic as soon as they are applied to concrete problems. Given the conditions of present-day social research, the path sociology must take is one of laborious ascent, from the description of social phenomena to detailed comparison, and only then, finally to the formation of more general concepts. In the final analysis, the opposition between empirical and theoretical inclinations comes down to the fact that the empiricists, according to the standards passed down by their tradition, only consider conclusive inductions to be valid candidates for fundamental theoretical propositions, and believe we are still far off from arriving at any of this kind. Their theoretical opponents, on the other hand, are those who consider other methods which are perhaps less dependent on the procedure of data collection to be valid procedures for the formation of fundamental categories and insights. Durkheim himself, for instance, may fundamentally agree with the empiricists, but where the principles are concerned maintains that the process of induction is insufficient. Rather, for Durkheim, the classification of social processes on the grounds of merely empirical inventories is neither possible nor desirable, since it cannot generate the simplification sought by the researcher. Its role is to supply us with a reference point to which we can add observations, other than those which these reference points have already provided. But for this, the classification must be made, not on the basis of a complete inventory, or of an individual characteristic, but according to a small number of them, carefully selected. It will spare the observer from the following up many lines of inquiry, because it will serve as a guide. We must therefore select for our classification characteristics which are particularly essential. Whether the most fundamental principles are to be obtained through selection, intuition, or mere stipulation makes no difference with respect to their function in an ideal theoretical system. In any case, what is certain is that the scientist is to bring their more or less general propositions to bear on newly emerging facts in the form of hypotheses. The more phenomenologically oriented sociologists will of course insist that once a law of essence has been established, it is indubitable that each exemplification of this law must behave accordingly. But the hypothetical character of the Weissengenstens is subsequently revealed, the law of essence, is subsequently revealed in the problem of whether a given case is really an exemplification of the essence or of another, related essence instead, whether a given case is a good or poor specimen of this genus, or perhaps a better specimen of the genus entirely. In all cases, on the one side stands conceptually formulated knowledge, and the other a state of affairs to be subsumed under it. In this subsumption, that is to say, the establishing of a relationship between the conceptual order of our knowledge and the sheer perception or mere statement of a state of affairs, is what is referred to as a theoretical explanation. At this juncture, we need not discuss the various kinds of classification in detail. Rather, we need only indicate briefly how the explanation of historical events relates to the traditional concept of theory. This comes to the fore clearly in the controversy between Edmund Meyer and Max Weber. Meyer held the question of whether wars unleashed by specific historical figures might have happened at an earlier or later date if said figures had not made certain decisions as unanswerable and pointless ones. Weber, however, argued that were this kind of historical explanation itself would be impossible. In connection with this physiological theory of von Kreis and the following political economists such as Merkel, Leifman, and Radbruch, Weber proposed the theory of objective possibility. According to this theory, the explanation of the historian, like the procedure of the criminal lawyer, consists not in the complete enumeration of all the circumstances involved in each case, but rather in foregrounding the connection between determinate components of the event, components which are of interest for establishing the course of history, and the individual determinative process. This connection, for example, the judgment that the war was unleashed through the intentional policies of a certain statesman, logically presupposed that, in the event these policies were not implemented, the result would have been a different effect than the one that its connection is supposed to explain. Any claim about determinate historical causation always entails that, on the grounds of known rules of experience, in the absence of a certain cause, a different effect would have resulted under the given circumstances. The rules of experience are nothing other than the formulations of our knowledge of economic, social, and psychological connections. With such rules in hand, we construct the most probable course of events through the alternating omission and inclusion of the events supposed to serve as explanations. The procedure is an operation of conditionals applied to a given situation. Given circumstances A, B, C, D, then event Q, in the absence of D, then event R, with the addition of G, then event S, and so forth. Such calculations are as much a part of the logical framework of history as they are of natural science. This is the mode of existence of the theory in the traditional sense. This, what scientists across the most diverse fields regard as the essence of theory, does in fact correspond to its immediate task. The manipulation of physical nature and that of certain economical and social mechanisms alike requires the formation of the material of knowledge according to the order of operations of a structure of hypotheses. The technological advances of the bourgeois era cannot be separated from this function of scientific enterprise. On the one hand, it makes facts capable of producing knowledge that is useful under given conditions. On the other, it applies given knowledge to the facts. There can be no doubt that such a work is a constitutive moment of the continuing transformation and development of the material foundations of our society. To the extent the corresponding concept of theory becomes autonomous, however, as if it were justified on the grounds of the internal essence of the cognition itself, or in any other ahistorical manner, theory transforms into a reified ideological category. The fruitfulness of the newly discovered factual connections for the transformation of pre-existing knowledge and the application of this knowledge to facts are both determinations that cannot be reduced to purely logical or methodological elements, but are only really intelligible in the context of real social processes. That a discovery occasions the restructuring of pre-existing views is never solely justified through logical considerations, or to be more exact, because the discovery contradictions determinate parts of the dominant theoretical representations. After all, it is always possible that auxiliary hypotheses might be thought of to avoid having to make any changes to the theory as a whole. Whereas new points of view succeed one another in the sciences on the basis of the entirely immanent motives from the perspective of the scientists themselves, this too occurs only in a concrete historical nexus. While modern epistemologists don't deny this fact per se, when it comes down to decisive extra-scientific factors, what they usually have in mind is less the determination of scientific thinking by social relations than genius or chance. The fact that the difficulties traditional astronomy have become ensnared by 17th century were resolved not through the addition of further ancillary constructions, but instead through the adoption of the Copernican system, was not due to its logical properties alone, such as its greater simplicity. These properties themselves only counted as an advantage on the foundation of the social practice prevailing in that epoch. How the Copernican system that was hardly mentioned in the 16th century became a revolutionary force in the 17th century is part of the overall social process in which mechanistic thinking rose to dominance. The dependency of such changes in scientific structure on the respective social situation is not only valid in the case of theories as comprehensive as that of the Copernican system, but also valid for changes in specific research problems in everyday life. Whether the discovery of new variants in the individual realms of anorganic or of organic nature, whether in the chemical laboratory or in the course of paleontological research, will lead to a transformation of the older systems of classification or generate new ones altogether, can never be derived from the logical standpoint of these discoveries alone. Modern epistemologists often rely on a concept of the expediency, which seems at least to be imminent to their flavored scientific discipline. Whether and how new definitions are formed in an expedient manner, however, depends not just on the simplicity and complexity of the given system, but also on the direction and the goals of research, and neither of these can be fully explained or even finally rendered intelligible exclusively in terms internal to the system itself. As with the influence of the material on the theory, so too with the application of the theory to the material, it is not a purely intra-scientific process, but a social one. The relationship of hypotheses to facts is ultimately not one established in the head of the scholars, but in industry. The rules of coal tar, if subject to certain influence, manifest certain colors, or that substance such as nitroglycerin, saltpeter, and others possess extremely large explosive force, are accumulated knowledge in the actual application of the facts in the factories halls of large business trusts. Among the different philosophical schools, the positivists and pragmatists in particular seem to take into account the interconnection of theoretical work in the life process of society. They characterize the task of science as foresight and the practicality of its results. However, in reality, this purposefulness, this belief in the social value of one's profession, is the private affair of the scholar. They might as well believe in an independent, super-social, free-floating knowledge as in the social significance of their discipline. This difference of interpretation wouldn't have the slightest bearing on their actual activity. The scholar and their discipline are harnessed together in the social apparatus as a whole. Their performance is a monument in the self-preservation and continuous reproduction of the existing order. No matter how the specialists might make sense of it themselves, they only have to correspond to the concept, that is, to produce theory in the above designated sense. The social division of labor, the scholar, is supposed to oversee the conception and classification of facts in the conceptual order and maintain them, such that they themselves and anyone who might use them can manipulate the widest possible domain of facets. The experiment in science is meant to establish facts in a manner particularly appropriate to the respective situation of the theory in each case. The material facts, the stuff of science itself, is supplied from the outside. Science ensures it is brought into clear and utilizable formulation, such that the knowledge can be manipulated however one wants. For the scholar, the incorporation, transformation, and rationalization of factual knowledge takes the form of a particular kind of spontaneity, or theoretical activity, whether it involves an in-depth presentation of the material, such as in history, and the other individual descriptive sciences, or the summarizing of large quantities of data, and the production of universal rules, such as physics. The dualism of thinking and being, understanding and sensibility is natural to them. Yeah, this is pretty similar to what Bordia talks about in The Legend of the Piave. I did a reading of that. It also kind of talks about how in like modern, capitalist society, you have this division of labor and experts and professorship, and mostly the purpose of this is because it defers responsibility indefinitely. The traditional representation of theory is abstracted from the scientific enterprise as it develops internal to the social division of labor at a given stage. It corresponds to the activity of the scholar performed alongside all the other activities in society, without, however, the underlying connection between the individual activities being immediately transparent. Therefore, the real social function of science does not appear in this representation, nor the significance of theory for human existence, but only the significance theory has for the same divorced sphere in which it is generated under certain historical conditions. In truth, the life of society results from the coordinated labor of the various branches of production. Even if the division of labor under the capitalist mode of production functions poorly, its branches, science included, should not be regarded as autonomous and independent. Rather, the sciences are particular forms and ways in which society confronts nature and preserves itself in its given form. They are a moments in the process of social production, even if they are themselves less productive or hardly productive in the strict sense. Neither the structure of industrial and agricultural production, nor the separations of so-called leadership and executive functions, services and labor, intellectual and manual activities, are internal or natural relations, but rather arise from the mode of production in determinate social forms. The illusory semblance of the autonomy of the different labor processes, the course of which is supposed to be guided by the inherent essence of their respective objects, corresponds to the descriptive freedom of the economic subject in bourgeois society. They imagine they are acting in accordance with the individual decisions, but even the most complex calculations functions as exponents of the impenetrable social mechanism. The false self-consciousness of the bourgeois scholar under the liberalistic era is manifest in the most diverse philosophical systems. It found its most succinct expression around the turn of the century in the Marburg school of Neo-Kantianism. In it, individual aspects of the theoretical activity of the specialist scholars are transfigured into universal categories, so to speak, moments of the world spirit, of the eternal logos, or rather decisive aspects of social life, are reduced to those of the scholar's theoretical activity. The power of knowledge becomes the power of origin. Creation is understood as the creative sovereignty of thinking. So far as something appears as given, all of its determinations must be constructible from theoretical systems, in the last instance mathematics. All finite magnitudes must be derived from the concept of the infinitely small by means of infinitesimal calculus. This is what is meant by their creation. The unified and in this sense all-powerful system of science is the ideal, and because the object is dissolved into conceptual determination, the end result of the work is nothing fixed or material. Everything is grounded solely on the determining, classifying, unifying function, which is what all human effort is directed towards. Creation means creations of unity, the creation of which is creation itself. The progress in consciousness of freedom, according to this logic, really consists in the fact that more and more of the otherwise impoverished world confronted by the scholar is rendered expressible in the form of the differential quotient. Whereas in actuality, the scientific profession is a non-autonomous movement along the branches of labor. The historical activity of human beings and this conception of the former displaces the latter, insofar as the reason is actually supposed to determine the events in a future society. The hypostasization of the logos in the reason inherent to the actuality itself is also a kind of utopia in disguise. In the present, however, the self-knowledge of human beings is not that of the mathematical natural science, nor what appears in the guise of the eternally appearing logos, but the critical theory of the present-day society governed by an interest in the rational conditions. The isolated contemplation of individual activities and branches of activity, together with the content in objects determined in order to be true, a concrete consciousness of their own limitations. The consciousness points towards the conception in which the one-sidedness to which these particular processes are necessarily bound, given their withdrawal from the total social practice, is abolished. In representation of theory as it necessarily appears to the scholars on the grounds of their own profession, the relation of fact in conceptual order serves as an important point of departure for an overcoming of this kind. Even the dominant epistemology has recognized the problematic of this relation. What repeatedly comes to the fore is that the same objects which constitute problems for one discipline that are hardly likely to be solved in the foreseeable future are in another discipline taken for granted as simple facts. Connections which have been abandoned as themes of research in physics are taken as self-evident presuppositions in biology, internal to biology itself. The same holds true for the physiological processes in relation to the psychological. The social sciences assume the entirety of human and extra-human nature as given and are interested in the order of the relationships between man and nature and the relationship among human beings. But the concept of theory cannot be developed further by reference to its immanent relativity in the relation of theoretical knowledge and facts, but only through a much more radical investigation, not just of the scientist, but of the knowledge and knowing individuals as such. The entirety of the perceivable world as it exists for the members of bourgeois society, and as it is interpreted from within the world interwoven with it, confronts the subject as subtotal of facticities, all which are simply there and must therefore be accepted. The ordinary thinking of each individual belongs to the set of social relations by means of which they tend to adapt themselves to their reality, in a way that corresponds most with given needs. There is, however, an essential distinction between individual and society in the respect. The same world, which is something in itself pre-existent of the individual, something individuals must assume and take into account, is nevertheless in the shape it exists and persists, just as much a product of overall social practice. Whatever we perceive in our environment, cities, towns, fields, and forests, bears the stamp of social practice. Human beings are not only products of history in their dress and demeanor, in their corporeal form and mode of feeling, but the very way in which they see and hear too is inseparable from the social life process, having developed over the course of millennia. The facts as they are conveyed to us by our senses are socially preformed in a double sense, through the historical character of the perceived objects and through the historical character of the perceiving organ. Neither are merely natural, both are formed and reformed through human activity. In perception, however, individuals experience themselves as mere receptive and passive. The opposition of passivity and activity, which appears in epistemology of the dualism of the sensibility and understanding, does not apply to society in the same way it applies to the individual. Where individuals experience themselves as passive and independent, society composed of such individuals is the active subject, albeit not consciously, and therefore not in the true sense. The distinction in and between the existence of the individual human being and society is an expression of the fragmentation that characterizes all historical forms of social life to date. The existence of society has been either based on the direct oppression or of a blind result of conflictual forces, but in any case, not the consequence of the conscious spontaneity of free individuals. Therefore, the significance of the concept of passivity An activity changes according to whether they refer to society or to the individual. In the bourgeois economic mode, the activity of society is blind and concrete, the activity of the individual abstract and conscious. There is always some measure of planning in human production. To the extent this is external to the individual and introduced to the theory from without, and that this fact is itself socially produced, there must also be some reason to be found in this, in however limiting the sense. Social practice does in fact always contain pre-existing and applied knowledge. Whenever a fact is perceived, it has already been co-determined by human representations and concepts before ever being theoretically processed by the individual. What's at issue here is not just a question of natural scientific experiment, the so-called purity of the factual process, which must be organized through an experimental setup, is unquestionably tied to the technical conditions, which themselves have an immediate obvious connection to the material process of production. The issue is rather the question of the mediation of the factual through the social practice as a whole becomes confused with the question of the influence of certain instruments of measurement has on the object under observation, that is, the influence of this or that particular scientific procedure. This special scientific problem, which arises constantly in the practice of physics itself, is not, however, more closely related to the problems we've posed than is the problem of perception in general, including that of perception in everyday life. The physiological apparatus of human sensation has long worked along the lines of physical experimentation. The mode in which pieces are separate and recombined in perception, the way that certain things go unnoticed while others are emphasized, is just as much a result of the modern mode of production as the perception of a man from a tribe of primitive hunters and fishers is a result of the conditions of his existence. This extends to the object itself. In this respect, the proposition that tools are extensive of human organs can just as easily be formulated in reverse, namely, that human organs are extensions of the instruments. At the higher stage of civilization, conscious human practices are at the same time consciously determines not just the subjective side of perception, but to an even greater extent the object. What the members of capitalist society see in their everyday surroundings, tenement, buildings, factories, halls, cotton, wool, heads of cattle, human beings, and not just in their brute corporeal form, but through the movement in which they arise from perception. Viewed from subway cars, elevator cages, automobiles, airplanes, this sensible world in itself bears the imprint of conscious labor, and the divorce between what belongs to the unconscious nature of what belongs to social practice cannot be followed through in reality. Even where the experience of natural objects as such is concerned, their naturalness is itself determined through contrast to the social world and to that extent dependent on it. Moreover, the individual incorporates sensible actuality as a mere succession of facts into conceptual orders, and these two have developed in the variable context of and connections with the life process of society. If therefore classification in the system of the understanding, judgment of various objects occurs as a rule, as if it were entirely self-evident and with remarkable agreement between the members of the given society, then this harmony, both the harmony between the perception and the traditional thought, and the harmony between the monads, the individual subjects of cognition, is no metaphysical coincidence. The power of Gesunden, Menschenverstandes, of common sense, from which nothing is concealed, and the validity of intuitions in all fields, not directly connected with social struggles, such as in the natural sciences, is conditioned by the fact that the world of objects is produced in greater measure by the same forms of thought by means of which it is recognized and conceptualized by the individual. In Kant's philosophy, this state of affairs is expressed in idealistic form. The doctrine of purely passive sensibility and the active understanding prompts the question of how the understanding comes to possess the certainty in advance, or that it will be capable of processing the manifold given in a sensibility under its rules for all time. He expresses openly the thesis of pre-established harmony, a pre-formation system of pure reason, one in which the rules that are innate to thinking would intrinsically govern its objects as well. His explanation is that the sensible appearances are already formed by the transcendent subject, that is, through the rational activity when they are perceived and judged within consciousness. In the most important chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant attempts to provide more rigorous grounds of justification for this transcendent affinity, the subjective determination of sensory material of which the individual knows nothing. Okay, I'm gonna interject here. I'm gonna do this 4 times throughout the text because I find it very dense and basic. So basically, I am going to read every 4 sections my notes on the content of that section at the end of it. And that way, hopefully, it'll be easy to follow along as I do the whole thing. The dominant concept of theory is formal, deductive, and system-oriented. Theory in the most pregnant sense is a systemic interconnection of propositions in the form of systemically unified deduction. Validity comes from testing the basic principles of the theory against facts. This model ultimately aspires to universalize science, reducing all domains to a single conceptual apparatus. Theory formation has become a matter of mathematical construction, even in social sciences. All sciences share the same formal abstract model of theory, regardless of method. Theory operates through conditional reasoning and hypothetical causality. Even in history, such as given circumstance A, B, C, D, then event Q, in the absence of D, then event R, and so on. However, this is problematic in that the dependency of such changes in scientific structures on the respective social situation. For example, Copernican theory triumphed not just for logical reasons, but for historical ones. Copernicus needs Ptolemy to refute, otherwise he has nothing to improve on. In this way, theory is socially conditioned and cannot be purely logically derived. The relationship of hypotheses to facts is merely realized in industry and production. It is not a purely intra-scientific process, but a social one. The relationship of hypotheses to facts is ultimately not one established in the heads of scholars, but in industry. The rules that coal tar is subject to certain influences, manifest certain colors, or that the substances such as nitroglycerin, saltpeter, and others possess extreme explosive forces, are accumulated knowledge and actual application to the facts in the factory halls of large business trusts. Science functions within the division of labor and serves social reproduction. The scholar is a movement in the self-preservation and continuous reproduction of the existing order. So theory must be understood as a social activity that does not exist as an autonomous intellectual pursuit. What we perceive as facts are social preformed in a double sense. The very way in which they see and hear is inseparable from the social life process. Both object and subject are socially constituted. This distinction becomes also very important in Dialect of the Enlightenment later. Where individuals express themselves as passive, society is the active subject. There's a split between individual consciousness and social activity, rooted in historical social forms. Anyways, that's all my notes for that first quarter. Following Kant's own intuition, the difficulty and obscurity of the central motives of the deduction and schematism of the pure concepts of the understanding can be attributed to the fact Kant represents super-individual activity, unconscious to the empirical subject, solely in the idealistic form of consciousness in itself, a purely spiritual agency, but does not perceive, given the limitations of the achievable theoretical perspective in his period, reality as a product of social labor, one which through chaotic on the whole is goal-oriented in individual details. Where Hegel already sees the cunning of an objective reason, which is, in the end, world historical, Kant sees only an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real models of active nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover and to have open to our gaze. Even so, behind the discrepancy of fact and theory that the scholar encounters in his specialist endeavor, Kant conceives of a deeper lying unity, the universal subjectivity on which individual cognition depends. Social activity appears as transcendental power, as the epitome of spiritual or intellectual factors. Kant's assertion that its operation is shrouded in darkness, that despite everything its rationality is irrational, is not without a kernel of truth. However cunning the individual competitors in the bourgeois economic model may be, the whole itself is not consciously directed towards a universal goal. The life of the whole issues only from the intense friction, in a mutilated form so to speak as if by accident. The internal difficulties that beset all the highest concepts of Kantian philosophy, above all, the I-transcendental subjectivity, pure or original apperception, consciously in itself, are a testament to the depths and the sincerity of his thought. The two-sided character of the Kantian concepts, which on the one hand denote the pinnacle of unity and purposefulness, and on the other, something that remains obscure, consciencelessness and opaque, is precisely what captures the contradictory form of human activity in the modern era. The coordination of human beings in society is the mode of existence of human reason, and in turn, the mode through which they apply the forces at their disposal and affirm their essence. At the same time, however, this process, together with its results, remains alienated from them, appearing over and against them as an unchangeable force of nature, as supernaturally fate. Its waste of labor power in human life, its perpetual condition of war, its meaningless misery, and Kant's theoretical philosophy and his analysis of cognition, this contradiction is preserved. The unresolved problematic of the relation between activity and passivity, a priori and sense data, philosophy and psychology, is therefore not a subjective, but a necessarily conditioned inadequacy. Hegel exposed and unfolded these contradictions, but in the end reconciled them in the medium of a higher spiritual sphere. Hegel escapes the embarrassment of the universal subject, which Kant asserts, but nevertheless cannot define, by positing absolute spirit as the most real being of all. The universal for Hegel had already been adequately unfolded. It is identical with whatever has happened. Reason need no longer restrict itself to criticism of itself. In Hegel, reason has become affirmative. Indeed, even before the actual can really be affirmed as rational, given the enduring contradiction of human existence, the powerlessness of the individual before the relations they themselves generate. This solution appears as a private assertion, as a personal peace treaty between the philosopher and the inhuman world. This is a really good passage. I took a break to discuss it with someone. The classification of facts within pre-existing conceptual systems and the revision of their systems through simplification or the cleanup of a contradiction is, as explained above, a movement of the general practice of society, with the sundering society into classes and groups. It is evident that theoretical constructs will adopt different relationships to this general practice of society, according to which class or group the theories associate with. So long as the bourgeoisie class was subjected to a feudal order of society, the pure scientific theory that was connected to it in the period of its ascent contained tendency to the overall dissolution of the feudal order in a belligerent opposition to the old form of social practice. In liberalism, however, this tendency triumphed. This theory became characteristic of the dominant type of human being. Today, however, the development of social practice is less determined by the middle class competing amongst themselves. The same competition, through which they become increasingly dependent on large-scale improvements of the material apparatus of production and its products set then by leadership cliques at the various levels of command over economy and the state, international conflict with one another. To the same extent that theoretical thinking has become more focused on extremely specific purposes tied to these conflicts, particularly in the areas of war and industry, interest in theory itself has waned. Less and less energy is now dedicated to developing advancing the capacity for thinking as such, considering independently of its mode of possible application. These distinctions, to which a number of others might be added, do not, however, change the fact that theory in its traditional shape, the evaluation of the given, according to a conventional apparatus of concepts and judgments, one which still operative even in most simple conclusions, even the simplest consciousness, and which furthermore regulates the coordination of facts in theoretical forms, given the task of daily and professional life, continues to perform a positive social function. This intellectual activity incorporates the necessities and purposes, experiencing and skills, customs, and tendencies of the present-day form of human existence. Akin to a material instrument of production, it presents itself as a possible element of not only the present culture or whole, but also a more just, differentiated, and harmonious one. So far as this kind of theoretical thinking does not consciously adapt itself to external interest alien to its object, but actually concerns itself with the problems that come up in the course of its specific development, and in this connection poses a new problem and reinterprets old concepts wherever necessary, traditional theory may justly consider the achievement of the bourgeois era in technology and in industry as its legitimate results, and find assurances in this. Because traditional theory understands itself not as certainty, but as a hypothesis, however, its hypothetical character must be compensated for in several ways. That's an interesting observation. First, it uncertainly cannot be greater than it must be, and this must is circumscribed on the grounds of existing intellectual and technological means. the general utility of which has been proven. Second, the formulation of hypotheses, however improbable each individual hypothesis might be, is itself a socially necessary and valuable activity. In any event, the achievement of this activity are in no way merely hypothetical. On the whole, theoretical activity is still a kind of labor that is performed under the given social conditions, and must therefore have a possible application in principle. If the labor of theoretical activity is bought and sold below its value or is left unused, this is only because it shares the same fate as other kinds of concrete and potentially useful labor wasted under given economic relations. This activity nonetheless presupposes these very same economic relations, and it belongs just as much to the total economic process as it unfolds under determined historical conditions. But this has nothing to do with the question of whether scientific endeavors are themselves productive in the strictest sense. For a vast quantity of so-called scientific products, there is indeed a demand for them in the present order. They are rewarded with various honors, and a portion of their goods that stem from the productive labor that has been demanded for them in the present order. They are rewarded with various honors, and a portion of the goods that stem from the productive labor has been invested in them. This does not, however, have any bearing on their own intrinsic productivity. Even certain kinds of idle academic pursuits in university, together with various kinds of pointed intellectual subtlety and refinement, as well as the other necessities arising from the antagonisms of classes, metaphysical and non-metaphysical ideological formation alike, have of social significance all of their own, without needing to actually correspond with the interests of any noteworthy majority in present-day society. For an activity to contribute to the existence of society in its given form, it needs not be productive, that is, value-creating, for an enterprise. Nevertheless, such activity finds a place in the framework of this order and reinforces this order, in turn, as in the case of specialized academic disciplines. There is a kind of human attitude, however, which takes society itself as its object. It is directed not at the rectification of certain wrongs, which rather appears to it as necessarily tied to the organization of social structures as a whole. Though it arises from the same social structure, the better functioning of the structure is neither its conscious aim nor its objective significance. The categories of better, useful, expedient, productive, valuable are as valid in this social order as are themselves susceptible to this orientation, and are by no means extra scientific presuppositions for which it cannot be held responsible. As a rule, it is part and parcel of the individual's constitution to accept the basic conditions of their existence as a given, to strive to fulfill them, to find gratification and to respect for themselves in the performance of tasks assigned to them by their place in society, to diligently carry out the utmost of their ability what if they have to do, however vigorously they might criticize things in individual detail. The critical attitude, however, is devoid of any trust in the guiding principle that the prevailing form of social life provides us. The separation of individual and society, by virtue of which the individual accepts the prescribed limits of their activity as natural, is abolished in critical theory, insofar as it begins to see the blind coordination of contingent frameworks. That is to say, the given division of labor and class distinctions, as a function which springs from human action and therefore as one potentially subject to a planned decision and irrational objectives. In subjects of critical bearing, the ambivalent character of the social whole in its current shape develops into conscious contradiction. In recognition of the present mode of production and the totality of culture founded on it as the product of human labor, the form of organization humanity gives itself to our epoch according to its historical development as capacity, these subjects identify themselves with this whole, comprehending it as will and reason. This world is their own. At the same time, these subjects experience this society in comparison to extra-human processes of nature. Sure biological and physical mechanisms for the prevailing forms of culture rest on struggle and oppression, but do not bear witness to a unified self-conscious will. This world is not their own, but the world of capital. Previous historic theory cannot really be understood. Only individuals and individual groups in history intelligible, but never completely, because of their internal dependency on an inhuman society. They function mechanically, to a large extent, even in their conscious actions. This identification is therefore contradictory, and this contradiction brands all concepts of the critical mode of thinking. In this sense, the economic categories of labor, value, and productivity are valid to it precisely because of what they are internal to this order of society, and any other interpretation of these categories would be rank idealism. At the same time, to simply accept the validity of these categories would be the grossest of untruths. The critical recognition of the categories that govern social life simultaneously contain their condemnation. This dialectical contradiction of the self-conception of present-day humanity is also what explains the ultimate self-obscurity of the Kantian critique of reason. Reason can never become self-transparent so long as human beings act as members of an organism without reason. The organism, in which the sense of a naturally growing and decaying unity is no mode of society, but a crude form of being from which society has to emancipate itself. The attitude oriented towards this emancipation, which has the transformation of the social whole as its goal, may indeed engage in theoretical work that is carried out internal to the orders of existing reality, but it dispenses with the pragmatic character that stems from traditional thinking as a professional activity with social utility. For theoretical thinking in the traditional sense as explained above, both the genesis of determinate states of affairs and the practical application of conceptual systems through which the forms are grasped, and so the role of theory and practice are considered as external. This alienation, which is expressed in philosophical terminology as the separation of science and value, knowledge and action, along with other oppositions, safeguards the scientists from the contradiction indicated above and provides a fixed framework for their work. Any thinking that doesn't recognize this framework seems to have the ground pulled out from under it. Could any theoretical procedure that can't be reduced to the determination of facts on the basis of the simplest and most differentiated possible conceptual system represent anything but a directionless intellectual game? Half conceptual poetry, half powerless expression of emotional states? Investigation into the social conditioning of facts and theories may well constitute a legitimate research problem, or even a whole field of theoretical work, but it is nonetheless not immediately clear how studies of this kind should be distinguished from other specialist endeavors. Ideology research, or the sociology of knowledge, which have been isolated from critical theory of society and established as particular branches of the research, are opposed neither in essence nor in ambition from ordinary scientific practice. The self-cognition of thinking is accordingly reduced to their uncovering of relationships between points of view in social problems. The structure of the critical attitude, whose intention transcend those of prevailing social practice, has no greater kinship to such social scientific disciplines than it has to the natural sciences. Its opposition to the traditional concept of theory in general springs less from a difference of objects than a difference of subjects. For the bearers of this attitude, the facts that arise from labor in society are not external in the same measure the same facts might be as scholars of members of other professions, all of whom think lesser scholars anyway. Their concern is rather a reorganization of social labor, insofar as the factors of the matter given to perception are conceptualized as products that fundamentally belong under human control, or that should at least be subject to it in the future. The fact loses their character of sheer facticity. Whereas the specialist scholars as scientists look onto social reality together with its products as external to him and as citizens looking out for his own interest in it through writing political articles, membership in parties or charitable organizations, and participation in elections, but without in doing so connecting these two sides of his person or other modes of behavior, except at most through psychological interpretation, critical thinking today is motivated by the attempt to overcome this tension in reality, to abolish the contradiction between purposefulness, spontaneity, and rationality in the individual and the fundamental relationship of the social labor process. Critical thinking contains a conception of human being in conflict with itself so long as this identity has not been realized. If action determined by reason is inherent to the human being, then social practice, which forms the existence of the human being down to the smallest detail, is inhuman, and this inhumanity has a recursive effect on everything that occurs within this society. Something will always remain external to the intellectual and material activity of human beings, namely, nature as the sum of yet another uncontrolled factor with which human society must contend. To the extent, however, that this is still another part of this nature, consists of relations that depend entirely on human beings themselves. Their relationship to labor and their process of their own history, this externality, is no transhistorical eternal category, and nor is sheer nature in the sense provided above. Rather, this externality is a sign of a regrettable powerlessness. To submit to it as fate is anti-human and anti-rational. Bourgeois thinking is constituted in such a way that, in turning back to its own subject, it recognizes the ego, which imagines itself to be autonomous as a matter of logical necessity. By this very essence, it is abstract and self-contained individuality, even when it inflates itself into the ground of the world, or perhaps the world itself is its principle. That's another great line. Its immediate counterpart is the ethos, in which one considers themselves the unproblematic expression of an already existing community, as in Volkish ideology. That's another good line. In the latter, the rhetorical we is used in earnest. Speech believes itself the organ of the generality in the fractured society of the present. This thinking above all in social question is both harmonious and illusory. That's a really good analysis. Yeah, this is everywhere. Everyone talks about the political we. There is no political we. Okay? We, as proletarians or whatever, we do not have any power. We have no political power, ultimately, or very little. Okay? So, in reality, when people say we, they're creating a broad group of, the nation, or an identity group, etc. Okay? And the only purpose that's to justify the actions of people in power, ultimately. Because there's no political we. Okay? There is no us. We can't, we cannot critically, air quotes, critically support anything. That's not even possible. Because we don't have any ability to influence on this stuff. At least currently. We can build this influence, though. I think we do have to extend this influence. It's just not a lot, but we can build it. Okay, and that's what we should do. You're putting the cart for the horse when you say we need to create, a specific support group for a specific thing you like. Critical thinking in its theory opposes both. It is neither the function of an isolated individual nor of that of the generality of individuals. Rather, it consciously takes the determinate individual as its subject in the context of their actual relations with other individuals and groups, their conflict with a determinate class or classes, and ultimately as subject those who become one by mediation of the nexus of society and the nature as a whole. This subject does not come down to a point like the I of bourgeois philosophy. The presentation of this subject consists in the construction of the historical present. Nor is the thinking subject the site where the knowledge and object coincide, the locus from which absolute knowledge would therefore be one. This illusory semblance, the medium in which all idealism, since Descartes has survived, is, in the strictest sense, ideology. The restricted freedom of the bourgeois individual appears in the guise of perfect freedom and autonomy. Oh, this paragraph is really good. But this I, whether active merely as thinking or in other ways, is not and cannot even be certain of itself in such an opaque, consciousnessless society. In thinking above the human being as a cleft open between the subject and object, their identity lies in the future and not in the present. The method that leads to this future may, in the Cartesian idiom, be called a clarification, but in true critical thinking, this clarification does not signify a logical process, but a concrete and historical one. In the course of this process, both the social structure as a whole and the relationship of the theorist to class and society as such are transformed. That is, in this process, both the subject and role of thinking are transformed. The assumption of an essential immutability in the relation between subject theory and object is what distinguishes the Cartesian concept from any other kind of dialectical logic. That was a really important paragraph. How does critical thinking relate to experience? If it isn't just supposed to order experiences, but to orient itself to derive its own order, transcending principles from itself and of its own accord, then one might conclude it always remains purely immanent to itself alone. As in the case of idealist philosophy, that, to the same extent, is not just supposed to take flight into utopian fantasies. It merely sinks into formalist shadowboxing. The attempt to determine practical goals in a legitimate way through thinking alone is bound to fail. If thought is not content with the humble role assigned to it by existing society, then it must necessarily revert to long overcome illusions. Reflections such as these, however, fall into the error of understanding thinking in the same detached, specialized, and therefore spiritualistic way it occurs under the condition of the present-day division of labor. In social reality, the activity of thought has never been immanent to itself alone, but has always functioned as a non-autonomous movement of a labor process with its own trajectory. Through the contradictory movement of advancing and retreating epochs and forces, it tends towards the preservation, improvement, and development of human life. In the sequence of historical forms of social existence, the abundance of goods at each new stage reached in social development only directly benefiting small groups of human beings, and this constitution of social life manifests in thinking too, leaving its stamp on philosophy and religion. In the depths of this society, however, there has been a counter-striving to extend such enjoyment to the majority. For all the material purposiveness of the class organization society, every one of its forms has, in the end, proven inadequate. Slaves, serfs, and burghers have cast aside their yokes. This counter-striving has also contributed to the shaping of cultural formations, because in modern history it is demanded that every individual make the purposes of the whole their own and recognize their own purpose is in those of the whole. There exists the possibility that the trajectory of the labor process, or a trajectory that was taken without the guide of a specific theory, and as a result of the clash of disparate forces in the balance of which the despair of the masses was something decisive, might be raised in the consciousness and guided by a conscious goal. Thinking doesn't just spin this goal out of itself, rather it arrives at this goal through the clarification of its own function. In this historical process, human beings obtain insight through their own deeds, and thereby comprehend the contradiction inherent to their existence. The bourgeois economy was set up such that individuals would, through their securing their own happiness, would preserve the life of society. However, there was another dynamic inherent to this structure, by virtue of which ultimately results in an accumulation of power of fantastic proportions on the one side, reminiscent of the ancient Asiatic dynasties, and an utter material and intellectual powerlessness on the other. The original fruitfulness of this organization of the life process of society accordingly transforms into fruitlessness and stasis. Through their own labor, human beings reproduce a reality that enslaves them with increased intensity on an increasing scale, and that threatens them with every kind of misery. Consciousness's contradiction stems not from fantasy, but from experience. Where the role of experience is concerned, however, there is a distinction between traditional and critical theory. The viewpoints the latter theory holds concerning the goal of human activity, and draws from its historical analysis above all the idea of a rational social organization, adequate to universality, are immanent in human labor itself, without, however, having already found adequate forms of expression in individuals, or the general spirit of the time, past or present. A determined orientation of interest is required for the experience and perception of these tendencies. According to the theory of Marx and Engels, this orientation is necessarily engendered among the proletariat, the class directly involved in production. On the grounds of this situation with modern society, the proletariat experiences the connection between the fact that, on the one side, its labor puts ever greater tools of the struggle against nature into human hands, and on the other, constantly renews an obsolete form of social organization that renders it more and more miserable and powerless. Unemployment, economic crisis, militaristic, terroristic regimes, the whole condition of the masses, whatever which they experience anew every hour as producers, is not due to the limited technological capabilities of human beings, as may have been the case in previous epochs, but rather the social relations of production, which are no longer adequate to the present. The all-around employment of intellectual and physical means for the mastery of nature is inhibited by the fact that under prevailing social relations, these forces are entrusted to particular conflicting interests. Production is not organized for the life of the generality in the care of individuals, but is organized for the sake of individual powers and, when necessary, provision for the generality as well. This is inevitable, the result of the progressive principle that individuals ought to look out for themselves under the given order of private property. But in society, not even the situation of the proletariat is a guarantee of correct insight. However much it experiences the meaninglessness of the continuation and intensification of hardships and injustice, the differentiation of its social structure imposed from above prevents the formation of this insight. The dichotomy of personal and class interest, which is only broken through the exceptional moments, prevents this consciousness from immediate self-assertion. On the surface, the world appears otherwise to the proletariat as well. Any stance that would adopt its guidelines from the thoughts and moods of the masses, but which would be incapable of confronting them with their true interest and those of society as a whole, would fall itself back into servile independence on the existing order. The intellectual who is content to proclaim the creative power of the proletariat in reverent awe, adapting themselves to it and glorifying it, overlooks the fact that every evasion of theoretical effort, the effort which would spare themselves by taking such a passive attitude towards thinking, or indeed any other momentary conflict with the masses their own thinking might lead them to, only makes the masses blinder and weaker than they already have to be. The thinking of the theorists is as critical, forward-driving element, integral to their development. In utterly subordinating themselves to the respective psychological constitution of the class that presents itself to them as a force of change, these intellectuals enjoy the feeling of being connected to a tremendous social power. They are swept away in professional optimism. Whenever this optimism is shaken by periods of serious defeat, many of these intellectuals are left exposed to the danger of falling into a social pessimism and nihilism, just as bottomless as their optimism was exaggerated. They cannot bear the idea that in certain historical periods, the kind of thinking that is most timely, the thinking with the greatest depth of insight into its historical situation, the thinking most pregnant of the future, might be the one that isolates its bearer and throws them back on themselves. They forget the relationship between revolution and independence. Alright, now I'll do the notes for this section. So, philosophers like Kant and Hegel grasp something real, a unified subject, but mystify it. Social activity appears as transcendental power, which Kant sees as mysterious, and Hegel tries to resolve ideologically. Reason has become affirmative before the actual can really be affirmed as rational. Idealist philosophy misrecognizes social labor as metaphysical reason. The purpose of critical theory is to be emancipatory and reflexive, and to leave the realm of the purely descriptive. It questions the whole structure, not just improves it. The categories of better, useful, productive, etc. are themselves suspect in it, as it sees society as historically produced and transformable. Critical thinking seeks to overcome this tension in reality. We must view the human as a divided being, whose unity of individual identity lies in the future, and not in the present. Critical theory rejects the split between scientist versus citizen, and theory versus action. Critical theory is grounded in historical experience, especially that of the proletariat experiences the connection between productive power and misery. However, not even the situation of the proletariat is a guarantee of correct insight. Consciousness is not automatic. Critical theory requires both material position and theoretical mediation. On to section 3. If the critical theory society essentially consisted in the formulations of the respective feelings and representations of a given social class, it would not exhibit any structural difference relative to specialized science. It would amount to a mere inventory of the psychic contents of determinate social groups, that is, social psychology. The relation between social being and consciousness differ for the different social classes. The ideas by means of which the bourgeois explains its own social order, fair exchange, free competition, harmony of interests, and so forth, prove inherently contradictory, and therefore oppose the same order as soon as one takes them in earnest and thinks them all the way through to the end as principles of society. Therefore, The mere description of bourgeois self-consciousness cannot convey the truth of this social class, nor would the systematic classification of the content of this consciousness of the proletariat generate a true picture of existence and its interest. This would make critical theory another traditional theory, with its own particular approach to posing problems, not the intellectual side of the historical process of emancipation. This will be the case even if one were to limit themselves to the registration and communication of the representations, not just out of the proletariat in general, but of a more advanced segment of it in particular. Whether party or leadership, the real task of this theory would only be the registration and classification of these representations in a given conceptual framework as closely aligned with the facts as possible, and the ultimate goal of the theorist would be the prediction of future social psychological data. The activity of thinking, the construction of theory, would remain one thing and its object, the proletariat, would remain another. If, however, the theorists and their specific activity are comprehended in dynamic unity with the dominant class, such that their presentation of social contradictions appears not merely as an expression of the concrete historical situation, but just as much as stimulating transformation factors internal to it, then the function of critical theory proper comes to the fore. The process of confrontation between the most advanced segment of the class and the individuals who express the truth to and about them, and moreover the confrontation between these most advanced segments today with their theories and the rest of the class, this process must be understood as an interplay of forces in consciousness, one that unfolds not just the liberating forces within it, but also its striving, disciplining, and violent ones. The intensity of this confrontation is manifest in ever-renewed possibility of tension between the theorists and the class for whom they think. The unity of the social forces from which liberation is expected is, in Hegel's sense, at the same time their distinction. This unity exists only as a conflict which constantly threatens the subject caught up in it. This is particularly evident in the person of the theorist. Their critique is belligerent not only towards the conscious and apologists of the existing order, just as much towards the diversionary, conformist, or utopian tendencies within their own rank. Theory in its traditional form, one side of which is captured by formal logic, is part of the division of labor in the production process in its present form. Because the society of future epochs will have to confront nature too, these traditional intellectual techniques will not lose their significance, but will on the contrary have to be developed to as great an extent as possible. As a moment of the practice driving towards new social forms, however, critical theory is not a wheel in a mechanism that has already been set in motion. Through its victories and setbacks might retain vague analogy to the proof and disproof of hypotheses in scientists and theories of their opposition, finds no comfort in the fact that value is just another part of their specialist field. The theorists cannot sing the praises of Poincare's saying of the enrichment through the necessary rejection of the hypotheses. Their vocations in the struggle with their thinking is a pair. Their thinking is not independent, separate from it. Their activity incorporates many elements from theory in customary sense. Knowledge and prediction of facts in relative isolation. Scientific judgments in the posing of problems which, by virtue of their specialization, might diverge from ordinary, but nevertheless possess the same logical form. But everything that traditional theory can take for granted without further ado, its positive role in functioning society, its relation, however meaty and opaque, to the satisfaction of general needs, its participation in renewal of the life process and a social whole, all of these prerequisites, none of which the scientists usually concern themselves with there, since the fulfillment is rewarded and reaffirmed in the social position of the expert, are thrown into question by critical thinking. The desired goal of critical thinking, the realization of rational conditions of society, is, to be certain, grounded in the hardship of the present. The existence of this hardship, however, does not generate the image of its overcoming on its own. The theory that projects this image does not, however, work in the service of a reality already at hand, but merely reveals its secret. However precise its demonstration of the absurdities obfuscations for reality at any given moment, however horrible its haunt for every wrong, the orientation of the undertaking of critical thinking in general, the intellectual activity itself, no matter how promising it might be, receives no sanction from healthy common sense or custom. In this, it differs from all theories that prove themselves in mechanical engineering, military organization, and even blockbuster films. The theory is that even if pursued in isolation, for impression of applications, as in theoretical physics, ultimately align with some clearly demarcated kind of function of consumption, even if it consists only in the masterful manipulation of mathematical symbols, which good society rewards as proof of its humanity. There are no ready-made examples of how the future critical thinking works towards thoughts to be constructed. Nevertheless, the idea of a future society as an association of free human beings, already possible on the grounds of available technological means, has true content to which, despite all changes, witness must be borne. This idea, the insight that and how the ruling disorder and irrationality can even now be overcome, is unfailingly reproduced under prevailing social relations, but the realities it registers of the tendencies towards a rational society are not brought about beyond thinking by external forces, and whose end results thinking might subsequently come to recognize itself by chance. Rather, it is one and the same subject that insists on realizing in practice the better world it imagines in thought. What in the chaotic economy of today is an obscure correspondence of thinking and being, understanding and sensibility, human needs and their satisfaction, their correspondent, which appears accidental in the bourgeois epochs, will become a relation between rational purpose and its realization in the future. The struggle to realize this future mirrors the correspondence in refracted form, in the will towards the reconstruction of society as a whole, conscious in activity in the construction of this theory and practice so oriented, in the organization and community of those who fight for it, despite all the discipline imposed by the exigencies of their self-assertion, something of the freedom and spontaneity of the future arises in the ranks too. Whenever the unity of discipline and spontaneity has vanished, the movement turns into an affair on its own bureaucracy, a spectacle already part of the repertoire of recent history. However vividly the desired future might appear in the present, there is no confirmation. The conceptual system of the ordering understanding, the categories under which the dead in their living social, psychological, and physical processes are generally subsumed, the division of objects and judgments into specialized disciplines across individual fields of knowledge, this is the intellectual apparatus that has proven itself and become entrenched in connection with the real labor process. This is the intellectual world of the general consciousness. It has a firm foundation on which its representatives can always rely. Through the interests of critical thinking, or general too, they lack any general recognition. The concepts that arises under its sway are critical in relation to the present. Class, exploitation, surplus value, profit, immiseration, and collapse are movements of a conceptual whole, whose real significance cannot be found in the reproduction of present-day society, but must rather be sought in its transformation. Although critical theory is never arbitrary or random in its conduct, it appears to the prevailing modes of judgment to be something subjective and speculative, one-sided and usefulness. Since it runs contrary to existing customs of thought, habit that ensure the continuation of the past and oversees the concerns of the decaying order, and indeed runs contrary to all guarantees of our partisan world, it appears partisan and unjust. Above all, it has no material achievement to boast of. The transformation critical theory strives to bring about is not the kind that gradually takes hold, such that its success, though slow at first, might then continue to make a steady progress. Whether the number of the theory's adherents swells, whether they hold influence with existing regimes, whether they find support in the parties sympathetic to the theory, or at least particular parties unwilling to condemn it outright, this all belongs to the vicissitude in the struggle for a higher stage of human coexistence, but none of this is evidence that such a stage has already begun. Apparent success in these areas can always prove illusory or mistaken in retrospect. A new method of fertilization in agriculture, or a new application that's been found for medical procedure, may be far from ideal efficacy, but still meet with slight success. Perhaps the theories that inform such a technical experiments still need to be refined, revised, or overturned in connection with specific practices and discoveries made in other areas. At the very least, a quantum of labor will have been spared in relation to the results, and some disease will have been relieved, if not cured. The first result of the theory that drives towards the transformation of society as a whole is the intensification of the struggle it is linked to. Even if specific material improvements are won through the heightened resistance of certain groups, the force of whose resistance is indirect due to the theory, this does not mean that these groups are always sectors of society whose gradual expansion would, in the end, give rise to the new society. All representation of this kind is steady growth, but misunderstand the fundamental dissimilarity between, on the one hand, a fragmented social whole, in which material and ideological power functions for the maintenance of privilege, and on the other, the association of free human beings, in which each would have the same chance to unfold all powers of their own. This idea distinguishes itself from utopia through the demonstration of its real possibility on the grounds of the degree of development of the productive forces of humanity. However many tendencies might drive towards it, however many thresholds it must cross in transition, it must pass through. However desirable and valuable in themselves the preliminary stages towards its realization might be, whatever historical significance these stages might have for the idea itself will only become clear once the idea is realized. This kind of thinking might share one thing in common with fantasy, that an image of the future, springing from the profound understanding of the present, guides thoughts and actions, even in those periods where the courses of those things seems to lead further away from its realization. Periods in which every lesson seems to justify anything but the faith in its fulfillment. What this thinking involves is not the arbitrariness or supposed independence, but rather the tenacity of fantasy. It is up to the theorist to agitate on behalf of this tenacity among the most avant-garde groups of the dominated classes. Among the dominated classes on the whole, the task falls to these groups in turn. Harmony cannot govern the relation between these groups either. The theorist may be elevated into a relevant, secure position by the ruling class. Conversely, the theorist may be held to be an enemy or criminal at one moment, an otherworldly utopian at another. The dispute over the theorists remains unsettled, even after their death. Their activity does not speak for itself. Whatever historical significance it has depends on others who bear witness to it and act to see it through. It does not fit into any established historical form. The capacity of the acts of thinking that require of us in everyday practice, whether in the official business or in science, is the work of centuries of education for the human being. Failure to perform leads to pain, ruin, punishment. This intellectual mode of behavior consists essentially in the recognition and independence recreation of certain presupposed conditions required for a certain effect to arise. This is learned in the process through which has to experience what is good and bad for oneself, as well as through the organization and experimentation. What counts is immediate individual self-preservation. In a bourgeois society, the human being is provided ample occasions to develop a sense for it. This traditional kind of knowledge that is acquired through the experiment is also contained in critical theory and practice, but when it comes to the essential transformation of critical theory is concerned with, the concrete perception that would correspond to its absence of the unit, the change takes place in reality. If the proof of the pudding is in the eating, the time has not yet come. Comparison to similar historical events can only be made in a quantified way. Therefore, constructive thinking plays a much more significant role in critical theory as a whole, in relation to the empirical evidence much more so than it does in the healthy common sense. This is one of the reasons why people who were otherwise highly capable in the individual scientific area of a similar sectors of expertise can, despite their best intentions, prove themselves all too limited and incapable on questions that concern society as a whole. In all times when the transformation of society was the order of the day, those who had thought too much were opposed as dangerous. This brings us to the problem of intelligence in its relation to society overall. The theorist whose sole concern is accelerating development towards a society without exploitation may, as noted above, find themselves off the viewpoints that predominate among the exploited. Were this conflict not possible, there would be no need for theory. Whatever one needed would simply fall into one's lap. The conflict does not necessarily have to do with the specific class position of theorists, nor does it depend solely on their form of income. Engels was a businessman. For specialized sociology, which derives its concept of class not from the critique of political economy, but its own observation, the social affiliation of theorists is decided neither by their source of income, nor by the real content of their theory, but from the formal element of their upbringing or education. What constitutes intelligence is one's aptitude for a more expansive overview, not the vantage of industrial magnates intimately familiar with the world market, steering whole states from behind the scenes, but sweeping vistas of university professors and mid-level civil servants, doctors, lawyers, and the like. Intelligence, in short, always belongs to a particular social or even super-social strata. The task of the critical theorist is to overcome the tension between their own insight and the oppressed humanity for whom they think. According to its sociological concept, on the other hand, the intelligence of the intelligentsia is essentially characterized by the fact that it floats free, hovering above the class, surely a feat to boast of it. The neutrality of the category of intelligence corresponds to the abstract self-knowledge of the scholar. This sociology only summarizes how knowledge already appears in the bourgeois consumption of liberalism, useful under certain circumstances, regardless of whether it's knowledge of Marx, Mises, Lenin, Leibniz, Jaurès, Jevons. These figures are classified under the same sociological rubric, or rather, they're provided the political figures aren't expelled from the rank of intelligence and advanced and then arranged in their new role as potential students opposite the political scientist, sociologist, and philosopher, as those who know. The political actors are supposed to learn from the more knowledgeable authorities how to apply this or that means when they assume this or that position, and indeed whether the practical position they've assumed can be maintained with internal consistency. A division of labor opens between those who, participating in social struggles, affect the course of history, and the sociological diagnosticians who assign them their proper place within it. Critical theory stands in contradiction to the formalistic concept of mind, Geist, that underlies all such representations of intelligence. For critical theory, there exists only one truth, and the positive predicates of sincerity and internal consistency, of rationality and the pursuit of peace, freedom, and happiness cannot be ascribed to just any other theory or practice in the same sense. There is no theory of society, not even the theory of generalizing sociologists, which does not contain political interests. The truth of these interests must be decided not through seemingly neutral reflection, but through acting and thinking, that is, through concrete historical activity. It is utterly baffling when the intellectual of today conducts themselves as if it were up to them and them alone to take on the difficult labor of thought to arrive at the decision between revolutionary, liberal, and fascist ends and means. This hasn't been the case for decades. What avant-garde requires is practical wisdom in political struggle, not academic lectures about so-called position. At a time in which the liberating forces of Europe are themselves disoriented and trying to regroup, when everything is at stake in nuance within their own movement, when the indifferences that stem from defeat, despair, and corrupt bureaucracy threaten to annihilate all spontaneity, experience, and insight of the masses despite all their heroic courage, the nonpartisan and therefore abstract concept of intelligence offers a version of the problem that only conceal the crucial questions. Mind is liberal. It tolerates no external compulsion, no adjustment of its discoveries to the will of any power. It is not, however, divorced from the life of society. It does not float above it. So far as the tendency towards self-determination, towards the mastery of human beings over their own lives and over nature is imminent to it, the mind has the capacity to recognize this tendency as an active force in history. Considered in isolation, the identification of this tendency appears neutral, but just as the mind cannot recognize this tendency apart from its interests, it cannot raise the tendency to general consciousness except through real struggle. Thus, mind is not liberal. It is true that intellectual endeavors without conscious connection to any determinate practice and interest take up certain cause here and there according to certain demands of an academic or non-academic nature. Tasks which promise the most success may be of service to one historical tendency or another. However, the same intellectual endeavors can also inhibit and divert the development of mind, notwithstanding their formal correctness. And what fundamentally warps theoretical constructs has ever failed, in the end, to meet the requirement of formal correctness. The abstract concept of intelligence as a fixed sociological category, in which is supposed to have a certain missionary function, belongs in the structure to the hypothesizing of specialized science. Critical theory is neither rooted like totalitarian propaganda, nor free-floating like liberal intelligence. Distinction in the logical structure arise from the different functions of traditional and critical thinking. The highest position of traditional theory denotes general concern under which all facts of a given domain are supposed to be subsumed. For example, the concept of a physical process in physics, or the concept of organic process is in biology. These concepts establish hierarchies of genre and species consisting of corresponding relations of subordination, and in which facts are subsumed as individual cases, exemplars, or embodiments of respective genera. There are no temporal distinctions between the unities that constitute the system. Electricity does not exist before an electric field, and neither does the field exist before electricity, just as lines do not exist before and or after particular lines. Whether one temporal sequence or another may exist in individual cognition, it does not, in any event, on the side of the objects. Even physics has left behind the conception of more general aspects as hidden causes or forces, and the hypothesizing these logical relations. Only in sociology does this remain unclear. Whenever individuals' genera are introduced to the system, or whether changes are incorporated into it, this process is not customarily conceived in the sense that their determinations themselves are too rigid, or that they must prove inadequate, since either their relation to the object or the object itself changes without thereby affecting the identity of the system. Rather, these changes are considerable indications of a deficit in our previous insight, or as the substitution of individual parts of the object by others. Just as the map becomes obsolete, once forests have been cut down, new cities have sprung up and different borders have been drawn. This is also how any living development is conceptualized in discursive logic, or the logic of the understanding. That this person is first a child, now an adult, can only mean there is a fixed core that remains the same. This person, to whom both properties, childhood and adulthood, are both predicated. For positivism, on the other hand, there is nothing that remains identical at all. First there is a child, later an adult, each a different complex of facts. This logic cannot comprehend that persons change and nevertheless remain identical to themselves. Critical theory, too, begins from the abstract determinations. So far as the present epoch is concerned, it begins from the characterization of an economy grounded on exchange. The concepts which subsequently arise, such as commodity, value, and money, can function as genus concepts. For example, when relationships in concrete social life are judged under the aspect of exchange relations and the commodity character of exchange goods, but the theory itself is not exhausted in the relating of a certain concept to reality through the mediation of hypotheses. The beginning outlines already the mechanism through which bourgeois society, following the abolition of feudal regulations, the guild system and serfdom, does not immediately perish as a consequence of its anarchistic principle, but instead survives. Thus, the regulative effect of exchange, which underlies the bourgeois economic system, is reverted. The conception of the process between society and nature, which already plays a role in these stages, and the idea of a unified epoch of society, of its self-preservation and so on, these already spring from a fundamental analysis of the historical course of society guided by an interest in its future. The relation between the first conceptual connections to the factual reality is not, in essence, one of genus and specimen. The exchange relations they denote govern social actuality by virtue of its inherent dynamics, just as the metabolism largely governs organisms, plants, and animals. Even for critical theory, specific elements must be introduced in order to move from this fundamental structure to differentiated reality. But the introduction of such determinations, for example, the availability of gold reserves, the distribution of these reserves through still feudal sectors of society or foreign trade, does not take place through simple deduction, as is customary for self-contained special scientific theory. Rather, each step must include the knowledge of humanity and nature at our disposal, via the science and historical experience. This is obvious with respect to the theory of industrial technology, but applies just as much to the intellectual development of arriving at a differentiated knowledge of human modes of reaction, as is our topic of discussion here. The proposition, for instance, that the lowest class strata society under the determinate conditions have the most children plays an important role in the demonstration of how bourgeois exchange society leads by necessity to capitalism with a reserve army of labor in crises. The psychological justification of this order is left to a traditional sciences. The critical theory of society begins from an idea of a simple commodity exchange determined by relatively general concepts on the presupposition of the knowledge at its disposal. Drawing on materials from both one's own research and that of others, it then demonstrates how the exchange economy, in light of a given composition of human beings and things, which is of course the subject of change under the influence of this economy, must by necessity lead to an intensification of social antagonisms without having to violate the principles of this presentation of political economy, and moreover, how these antagonisms must, in the present historical situation, drive towards wars and revolution. The significance of the necessity invoked here is, much as with the abstractness of concepts, both like and unlike the significance necessity has in corresponding moments of traditional theory. In both kinds of theory, the rigor of intellectual deduction rests on exhibiting how the assertions of certain general determinations involves the assertions of a certain factual relations. If an electrical process is under consideration, then because the concept of electricity includes certain distinguishing characteristics, certain events must result. So far as the critical theory society develops present conditions from out the concept of simple exchange, it does in fact contain this kind of necessity. But the generally hypothetical form is a matter of relative indifference. For though it is true that capitalism must develop where a simple exchange society prevails, this is not where the emphasis lies. Rather, emphasis is placed on the derivation of this real society, capitalist society, which spreads from Europe to encompasses the whole world, and for which the theory claims to be valid, from the fundamental relation of exchange in general, whereas even the categorical judgments of the specialized sciences are fundamentally hypothetical in nature. An existential judgment, to the extent they are tolerated at all, are relegated to individual episodes directly in practical sections. The critical theory of society as a whole is a singular unfolding existential judgment. In rough outline, it holds that the basic forms of the historically given commodity economy, on which all the modern history reigns, encompasses both the internal and external antagonisms of the epoch, which it generates again and again in intensified form, a following a period of ascendancy, the unfolding of human forces, the emancipation of the individual, and the unprecedented expansion of human powers over nature, ultimately holds back all further development and drives humanity into a new barbarism. The individual steps internal to the theory are, at least according to their intention, of the same rigor as deductions internal to any special scientific theory. Each step is a moment in the constitution of the comprehensive existential judgment. Individual moments of the theory can be turned into a general or practical hypothetical judgment and finds application in the sense of the traditional concept of theory, as for example, the hypothesis that increasing the productivity as a rule leads to the devaluation of capital. If this operation is performed on some parts of the theory, this results in propositions whose relationship to reality is difficult to determine. It does not follow from the truth of a presentation of a unified object as a whole that individual parts have been detached from it, mapped in their isolation onto isolated parts of the object, except under special conditions. The problematic of whether individual propositions from the critical theory of society can be brought to bear on unique or repeatable processes in contemporary society is a problem of whether the critical theory can coincide with traditional intellectual endeavors with progressive purposes, but does not affect the truth of the critical theory of society itself. The inability of the specialized sciences, especially contemporary political economy, to derive any utility from critical theory in answering the piecemeal questions they pose does not have its foundation internal to specialized sciences themselves, nor even the internal to the critical theory alone, but rather in the different role each has in reality. The critical and oppositional theory, too, derives its statements about real social relations from general fundamental concepts, and it is precisely through such concepts that these relations appear as necessary. Though both theoretical structures are similar with respect to the necessity in the logical sense, an opposition arises as soon as it's not logical necessity, but objective necessity, or the necessity of actual processes that's under discussion. The statement of the biologist that a certain plant must wilt given certain imminent processes, or that a certain process inherent to the human organism leads by necessity to its death, leaves the question of whether there are any interventions that might influence or totally alter the character of these processes. Even when the disease is designated curable, the question of whether corresponding measures are undertaken is taken to be an external event, and therefore essential to the internal order of the theory itself. The necessity that governs society could accordingly be seen as biological. The particular character of critical theory could be subject to doubt for that reason. After all, in biology, as in other natural sciences, individual processes are theoretically constructed in a similar way that individual processes are by critical theory of society. The development of society would thus be understood as a determinate sequence of events, whose presentation includes the results from the various fields the theory draws on, just as physicians or geologists might employ various branches of knowledge to present courses of a disease or the prehistory of the earth. Society would accordingly appear as an individual object to be judged on the grounds of special scientific theories. No matter how many analogies there might be between these intellectual endeavors, there is a crucial distinction with respect to the relation of subject and object, and therefore to the necessity of the events under consideration. The subject matter of the specialist remains totally untouched by their own theory. Subject and object remain strictly separated from another human. Even if it should prove that, at some later point in time, objective events are influenced by human intervention, for this too must be considered a factum by science. The objective events are transcendent to theory, and this independence is part of their necessity. The observer as such cannot do anything to change them. The consciousness, critical attitude, however, is implied in the development of society. The construction of the historical course of society as a necessary product of an economic mechanism includes at the same time the protest that arises from this order and enters into opposition with it, the idea of the self-determination of the human species, that is, conditions in which humans' actions no longer flow from their mechanisms from his own decisions. Its judgment concerning the necessity of past events contains, therefore, the struggle to transform the necessity from a blind into a meaningful one. To conceive of the object of the theory separate from the theory itself falsifies the image, leading to quietism and conformism. Each one of its movements presupposes the existence of critique and struggling against the existing order according to an orientation determined by the theory itself. Okay, so, some notes. The mere description of bourgeois self-consciousness cannot convey the truth, nor would the systemic classification of the contents of the consciousness of the proletariat generate a true picture of its existence and interest. Critical theory is not the same as sociology or describing consciousness. Theory is not just about what people think. Proletarian consciousness can be ideologically distorted. Truth is not found in what classes think, but in analyzing objective contradictions of society. The main distinction between traditional and critical theory is that critical theory is active and not contemplative. The theorist's work is itself a stimulating and transformative factor. Emancipation involves struggle with consciousness, not just against external enemies. Unity between theorists and class exists only as a conflict. The intensity of this confrontation is manifest in ever-renewed possibility of tension between theorists and the class for whom they think. Theory in the traditional form is part of the division of labor and the production process in its present form, as science appears neutral but is embedded in the existing system. Critical theory seeks to overcome this separation to restore human agency. Critical theory has no immediate practical confirmation or production of measurable outputs, so apparent success can be totally illusory. A society of free individuals is materially possible, but present suffering does not automatically generate this future. Theory must project and fight for it. The subject that imagines emancipation must realize it in practice. The idea of a future society is already possible on the grounds of available technological means, but it requires conscious action. The dualism of thinking versus being leads to passivity and conformism. Traditional theorists see themselves as passive participants whose outcome they might foresee but never control. Anyways, on the last section, not without reason, though not completely justified, epistemologists taking physics as their point of departure have condemned the confusion of cause with effects, of force, and in the end exchanged the concept of cause for that of condition or function. The pure registering observation yields only series of appearances, never forces and counterforces, a result which is of course not inherent in nature, but the essence of mere observation. The result of this method in its appreciation to society is statistics and descriptive sociology, which can indeed become important for other purposes, including those of critical theory. For traditional science, necessity is either all or nothing, according to whether one understands necessity in terms of its independence from observers, or the possibility of absolutely certain prognoses. However, insofar as subjects refuse to separate themselves, even in their own thinking, from social struggles in which they participate, insofar as they refuse to separate the subject who knows and the subject who acts in two concepts, necessity acquires another meaning. Insofar as nature outside of human control stands opposed to it, it appears, on the other hand, as the realm of nature, which, despite the unending conquests humankind has yet to undertake, will never truly vanish. On the other, as the powerlessness of society to date to conduct its struggle with nature in a conscious and purposive form of organization, here forces and counterforces are indeed meant. Both moments of this concept of necessity and their interconnection, the power of nature and the impotence of humanity, are based on human experiences of striving for liberation from the compulsion of nature and from forms of social, legal, and political and cultural order, which have become fetters. Both are part of the actual striving for a condition in which what human beings desire is also a matter of necessity, a condition in which the necessity of the matter becomes one of the rational controlled processes. The usable and even understanding of these and other concepts of the critical mode of thinking are tied to the experiences of one's own activity and striving to the existence of a will internal to the knowing subject. Any attempt to rectify the deficient understanding of these ideas by means of their logical interconnection and concision, by apparently more exact definitions, or by a unified language, are doomed to failure. The issue isn't just one of misunderstanding, but of real opposition between different modes of behavior. The concept of necessity in critical theory is itself critical. It presupposes the concept of freedom, even as freedom does not yet exist. The representation according to which freedom has always been there, even where human beings are enchained, so to speak, of merely inward freedom, belongs to the idealistic way of thinking. The tendency of this is not completely untrue, but nevertheless long idea was given its clearest expression by the young Fichte. I am now thoroughly convinced that the human will is free, and that to be happy is not the purpose of our being, but to deserve happiness. Here the vicious identity between radical metaphysical opposites in the school is revealed. The assertion of the absolute necessity of events means in the last analysis the same thing as the assertion of real freedom in the present, resignation in practice. The incapacity to conceive the unity of theory and practice and the restriction of the concept of necessity to fatalistic events have had the epistemological grounds in the hypostaticizing of Cartesian dualism of thinking and being. This dualism is fitting for nature as much as bourgeois society itself, so far as the latter also resembles natural mechanisms. The theory that becomes a real power as the self-consciousness of the subject of a great historical upheaval transcends the mentality characterized by this dualism, so far as the learned not only hold this dualism in their heads, but also takes it in earnest. They're incapable of independent action. Bound in practice this way of thinking, they limit themselves to what the closest causal nexus of the reality has already determined, or entered into consideration only as individual units of statistical magnitude, in which the unit of the individual has no role to play. This is a great line. As rational beings, they are powerless and isolated. Knowledge of this fact does not indeed constitute a step towards its overcoming, but this knowledge only ever enters bourgeois consciousness in a metaphysical and ahistorical form. As faith in the inalterability of the form of society, this dualism does in fact dominate the present. In reflection, human beings see themselves as sheer spectators, passive participants in events of epic proportions whose outcome they might be able to foresee but never control. They do not recognize this necessity as one they impose on events themselves, but only as a necessity of events one can predict in advance of a greater or lesser degree of probability. Wherever the interweaving of willing and thinking, intuition action is given its place, as we find in the recent sociology, it is only ever in the sense that some complexity of the objection has to be taken into account. Any theory that comes up must be referred back to the practical position, the social class strata it is associated with. The subjectist sociologist, however, withdraws from such affairs. They have no concern other than science. The animosity towards anything theoretical, as expressed in public life today, is in truth directed against the transformative activity connected to critical thinking. Wherever a theory does not remain a mere observing and classifying under categories as neutral as possible, that is, categories that are indispensable for practical life in its given forms, it is immediately met with resistance. On the side of a large segment of the ruled, there is an unconscious fear that theoretical thinking might expose its hard-won adaptation to reality as wrong and unnecessary. On the other side, the beneficiaries of the ruling order, there is a general suspicion of the intellectual autonomy. The tendency to conceive a theory as antithetical to positivity is so strong that even the most harmless traditional theory is sometimes impacted by it. Because the critical theory of society is the most advanced form of thinking in the present, and because every consistent and meaningful intellectual endeavor concerned with humanity culminates in it, theory itself falls in disrepute. Any scientific statement that fails to provide information on the facts in the most common of categories in the most neutral mathematical form possible is met with the objection that it is too theoretical. This positive stance is not necessarily hostile to progress, though the sharpening of class antagonisms in recent decades has forced the ruling order to rely in greater measure on the real apparatus of power. Ideology continues to play a not insignificant role as cement-like factor that binds together the increasingly fractured social structure. Even today, the motto "stick to the facts and surrender all illusions" contains something of the reaction against the old alliance between oppression and metaphysics. It would be a mistake, however, to ignore the enormous distinction between the empiricist enlightenment of the 18th century and the empiricism of the present. In the 18th century, a new society had already developed within the framework of the old. In order to free the already existing bourgeois economy from its feudal fetters, it only needed to be allowed to run its course. The specific scientific thinking connected with the transformation needed only really shed its old dogmatic constraint in order to follow a path that had already been identified. However, in the transition from the present day to a future society, humanity will have to constitute itself for the first time as a conscious subject and actively determine its own form of life. Even where the elements of the future culture are already at hand, the conscious reconstruction of economic relations is still necessary. The undifferentiated animosity towards theory is accordingly an obstacle to its realization in the absence of continuous theoretical effort that critically examines the society of the present according to its interest in a rational organization of society in the future. A future society can be constructed by means of the traditional theories formed in specialized sciences. The hopes for any fundamental betterment of human existence is groundless. The demand for positivity and the subordination of a theoretical consideration, which threatens to numb the theoretical sensitivity of even the most progressive groups in society, necessarily affects not just the theory, but also the practice of liberation. The individual moments of the theory, which undertakes the derivation of complex relations of first liberal and then monopolistic capitalism from the schema of simple commodity economy, are not just as indifferent to the passage of time as the stages of a deductive ordering operation. Just as the digestive function, which is also crucial for human beings, can be found in the most elementary state in the form of the colinterata genera. In the history of organic beings, I assume that's some sort of microbe, I don't know. There's also a historical form of society, which approximate at the very least, simple commodity economy. The development of thought stands, if not in parallel relation to, then in determinable relation with the historical development. The essential relationship of the theory to time does not, however, lie in the correspondence of individual moments of the construction to certain historical periods, but in the continuous modification of the theoretical existential judgments of society, conditioned through conscious connection to historical practice. a method to which Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and logic are as much a testament as Marx's Capital. This has nothing to do with the principle according to which every determinate theoretical content must always be subject to radical questioning and must always be started over all over again. A principle modern metaphysics and philosophy of religion have used in their fight against all consistent theory formation. Critical theory does not have one content today and a different content tomorrow. Changes in the theory do not result in reversal of its perspective so long as the epoch itself remains unchanged. The consistency of the theory rests on the fact that despite all of the changes undergone by the society, its fundamental economic structure, class relations in their simplest form, remain identical. So too, therefore, does the idea of their abolition. The moments of the theory's content conditioned by the society cannot, therefore, be changed unless the society itself is overthrown. On the other hand, history does not, of course, simply stand still until the point is reached. The historical development of the antagonism, in which critical thinking has its own role to play, has a recursive effect on the importance of individual moments of the theory, compels its differentiation, and relocates the significance of special scientific discoveries for critical theory in practice. Yeah, I'm going to make a comment here, because honestly, I've been thinking about that recently, about this topic here. Because it's like, so they're like, these like there's a certain popular leftist intellectual kind of person, at least by YouTube standards person, and they've recently been like kind of a, I feel, warpath to dispel revolutionary ideas as quote unrealistic, basically, and therefore not worthwhile to pursue, and you should just be reformist because it's more realistic, which I think is a very reflexive and circular reasoning to fall under. But if you're an intellectual, I'm using the term not necessarily in a literal sense, but if there's someone who's conscious of the contradictions of society, I don't think your argument, your whole thing should be about how we need to find the middle ground with no one, find the middle ground with this imaginary big other, that we need to come with okay, well, maybe you want to have these, how about we just can we just have nice things or something? It's you only get nice things as concessions for doing revolutionary things, basically. It has to be tied to real contradictions to society and the possibility of their abolition. If the structure of society hasn't changed, then abandoning revolutionary theory isn't updating it or reconciling it. It's just less coherent. It's simply just less coherent. If the fundamental structure of society hasn't changed enough to make the ideas in question obsolete, then dismissing revolutionary theory is opportunism. I think the best way to phrase that, I think it's a great point by Horkheimer. I think what's kind of was getting at here. The concept of the social class, with control over the means of production, can be used to specify what we mean here. In the liberal period, economic domination was largely tied to legal ownership over the means of production. The large class of private property owners was the leading social strata, and the whole culture of the time was characterized by this relation. Industry was still differentiated into a large number of what would today be seen as small autonomous enterprises. The type of management of factories appropriate to this technological stage of development was that of one or more private owners, or their direct representatives. With the rapid progression in the concentration and centralization of capital over the last century, mediated by the development of technology, legal ownership has largely become separate from management as factories have been absorbed by the rise of large corporations. Management becomes autonomous from legal titles of ownership. This leads to the rise of industrial magnates, leaders of the economy. In most cases, corporations initially retain majority shares in ownership. Today, however, whether this condition is met is largely immaterial, as demonstrated by the fact that powerful individual leaders dominate whole sectors of industry and only hold legal titles for a small part of the companies they direct. This economic process involves a transformation in the function of the legal and political apparatus along with their ideologies. Without there being the slightest change in the legal definition of property ownership, the private owners become powerless to an increasing degree relative to the management and administrative staff. Direct control over the means of these large corporations gives management such a disproportionate weight in the legal processes private owners might initiate if dispute arrived that a successful outcome in favor of the latter is nearly unthinkable. The influence of the management, which might at first be restricted to the lower legal and administrative agencies, reaches into higher agencies as well. And in the end, in the end, into the state and its organization of power. Through their separation from the actual production, as their influence wanes, the horizon of mere holders of property titles narrows. Their living conditions and personalities become more and more ill-suited for socially crucial positions, and in the end continue to derive a share from property they can no longer contribute to the expansion of, and come to appear socially useless and morally questionable. In close connection with these and other changes, the ideologies of the great personality and the distinction between productive and parasitic capitalists emerge. The representation of right independent from that of the general public with fixed content loses its weight. From the very same idea that maintains private control over the means of production with brutal violence, this core part of the ruling social order, there arises the political doctrines that unproductive property and parasitic income must disappear, which actually dates back to John Locke. This comment actually dates back to Locke and his conception of property. With the shrinking of the circle of those with actual power, the possibility of conscious ideology formation grows, thus establishing a double truth for which knowledge is reserved for the insiders, and another version is present to the people, and the general cynicism towards all truth and all thinking spreads. Within this process, what remains is a society no longer dominated by independent property owners, but cliques of industrial and political leadership. These changes in society also condition structural changes in critical theory. It does not, however, fall prey to the illusion, as is cautiously advanced in the social sciences, that property and profit no longer play a decisive role. On the one hand, it has always considered these legal relationships not as the essence, but as the surface of the social facts of the matter. And it knows that the power of disposal over human beings and things is reserved for a particular sector of society, which, if it competes less on the domestic front, competes all the more bitterly on the global scene, with other economic powers and blocks. Profits stem from the same social sources and must, in the last instance, be increased through the same methods. On the other hand, in parallel with the elimination of laws with direct determinate content, which is conditioned through the concentration of economic powers and perfected in social relations of the authoritarian states, ideology disappears, and along with it, a cultural factor that is not merely a negative but a positive side. By incorporating these changes of the internal structure of the entrepreneurial class into its account, the theory differentiates its other concepts accordingly. The dependence of culture on social relations must therefore also undergo a transformation down to the last detail, given society is a totality. Already in the liberal period, the political and moral conception of individuals could be derived from their economic situation. The valuation of upright character, of standing by one's words, of autonomous judgment, and so on, arises from a society of relatively independent economic subjects who enter into association with one another through contract. This dependency, however, was psychologically mediated to a great extent, and morality itself acquires a kind of fixity on the grounds of the function in the individual. Of course, the truth that the dependency on culture, on the economy, prevailed in this morality becomes clear whenever the economic positions of the liberal bourgeoisie were threatened, leading to the liquidation of all liberal sentiments in their ranks, as demonstrated by recent events. Oh yeah, he's talking about World War II, stuff happened before then. Under the social relations of money capitalism, however, even this kind of relative autonomy of the individuals comes to an end. The individual no longer has any thought of their own to speak of. The content of the mass belief that no one really believed at all is an immediate product of the ruling bureaucracies of economy and state, and its adherents abate only their own atomized and therefore untrue interest as they act appear functions of the economic mechanism. The concept of the dependency of the culture of economic has therefore changed. With the annihilation of the typical individual, it has to be understood, so to speak, in a more vulgar materialistic sense than before. Explanations of social phenomena become simpler and at the same time more complex. Simpler because the economic more immediately and consciously determines the human being, and the relative force of resistance and substantiality of the various spheres of culture is weakening. More complex because individuals are degraded into mere media of the unfettered economic dynamic that, with rapid tempo, brings forth every new forms of catastrophes. Even the most advanced sects of society are seized by the same demoralization of the general helplessness, for the existence of truth, too, is tied to the constellation of reality. In 18th century France, it had an economically developed bourgeoisie on its side. Under the social relations of monopoly capitalism and the powerlessness of the workers, be it for the repressive apparatus of authoritarian states, truth has retreated into exceptional, small groups of those who decimate under the terror, have all too little time for sharpening the theory. The charlatans profit from this state of affairs, and the general intellectual level of great masses is in rapid decline. Given what has already been discussed, it should be clear that the constant upheaval of social relations, which issues directly from the latest economic developments and finds its most precise expression in the composition of the ruling class strata, affects not only the individual branches of culture, but also the meaning of culture's dependency on the economy, and thereby the crucial concepts of the conception as a whole. The influence of social development on the structure of the theory is integral to its own content. New content is not, therefore, mechanically added onto the given components of the theory, because the theory forms a unified whole that possesses its proper significance only in relatedness to the present situation. It is subject to an evolution, but one in which its foundations are not abolished any more than the essence of the object it reflects, present-day society. It becomes something different in its most recent restructuring. Even the most applicable, remote of concepts are drawn into the process. The logical difficulties that the understanding uncovers in every thought that mirrors a living totality are primarily grounded in this singular aspect. If one removes individual concepts and judgments from the theory and compares them with concepts and judgments isolated from an earlier conception of the same, contradictions will emerge. This holds as true for historical stages of development of the theory as a whole, as it does for the logical stages internal to the theory itself. In the concepts of enterprise and entrepreneur, there is, despite an internal identity, a distinction given whether these concepts are taken from the theoretical presentation of the earliest form of bourgeois economy, or from the theory of fully developed capitalism, and given whether they stem from the 19th century critique of political economy, which confronted the liberal men of industry, or the 20th century critique of political economy, which confronts the monopolists. Just as entrepreneurs themselves, the concept of the entrepreneur too, is subject to development. Contradictions between moments of the theory taken in isolation emerge not from errors or from omissions of definitions, but from the fact that the object of the theory itself changes in history. An object which, however derempted, I've never seen that word before. It is nevertheless one. Rather than storing up hypotheses about the course of individual events in society, the theory constructs the unfolding image of the whole, the existential judgment implicated in history, as discussed above. Whether the entrepreneur, and indeed the bourgeois man in general, has been, that for example his character contains the rationalist aspect as much as it does the irrationalist one, that at present predominates in the mass movements of the middle classes, traces back to the original economic situation of the bourgeoisie and is inherent in the basic concept of that theory. But this origin itself is only unveiled in the differentiated form in the struggles of the present, not just because of the changes undergone by the bourgeoisie in the course of those struggles, but also because in the context of the interest and falsity of the theoretical subject acquiring new accentuations. It may therefore be of a systemic interest, and not entirely useless, to classify and arrange the various types of dependency, commodity class, entrepreneur, and so forth, as they arise in the logical and historical phases of the theory. Since, however, their ultimate meaning only becomes clear in the context of the total theoretical construction, which must itself be continuously reshaped according to new situations, any system of types or subtypes of the definitions and specifications of concepts that have been removed from their context in critical theory will lack even the value that the conceptual inventories possess in other specialized sciences, which at the very least finds applications in the relative uniform practice of daily life. This makes any attempt to transform the critical theorist society into a general sociology a problematic one. The question we have posed about the relation of thinking and time is, of course, linked with a particular difficulty. Namely, that it is impossible to speak in a genuine sense of changes when it comes to a correct theory. Even the tracks of changes in theory already presupposes a theory itself burdened by the same problem. No one can make themselves into another subject than that of their historical moment. Strictly speaking, discourse about the constancy or changeability of truth has meaning only in a polemical sense. It is directed against the assumption of an absolute transhistorical subject, or against the assumption that subjects are interchangeable, as if one could in all seriousness step outside of the present historical moment and put themselves into another. The extent to which this is possible and the extent to which this is impossible cannot be indicated here. In any case, critical theory is incompatible with the idealist faith that theory itself transcends the human, or that it someday might. Documents have a history, but theory has no destiny. The statements that there are still determinate movements that must be introduced into the theory, that it must be adopted into a new situation in the future without thereby changing in its essential guiding content, all of this belongs to the theory as exists and strives to determine practice today. Yes, exactly. Those who have a whole theory in their heads have it as a totality and orient themselves in action accordingly. Confidence in the progress of the science and the constant increase of subject-independent truth can, in its circumscribed validity, refer to the most of the function of knowledge that will also be an element of future society, the mastery of nature. Even this knowledge, however, belongs to the existing... Lost my place. Even this knowledge, however, belongs to the existing social totality. The presupposition for any statement about its duration or transformation, namely the process of economic production and reproduction through established forms, is in a certain sense synonymous with the attempt of interchangeable subjects. That society is split into classes does not mean that any identification between human subject is in vain. In this respect, knowledge is a thing that one generation passes on to the next. So far as the next generation has to live, that knowledge will be needed. Here too, the traditional scientists can rest assured. But the construction of a society guided by the image of radical transformation that hasn't yet withstood the test of its real possibility lacks even the fact of being shared by many subjects and recommended. To strive for a condition without exploitation and oppression, a condition in which an actual, comprehending subject, i.e. self-conscious humanity, exists, and in the pursuit of which one can indeed speak of a unified theory formation and thinking that both transcends and encompasses individuals, is not yet the actualization of that condition. The strictest possible transmission of critical theory is of course a condition of its historical success. However, the transmission of critical theory occurs not on the firm ground of entrenched practice and fixed modes of behavior, but instead through an interest in transforming the fixed and entrenched. Through this interest reproduces itself in the context of prevailing injustice, it is given form and direction by the theory, and has a recursive effect on it. The circle of those who carry on this tradition are not defined or renewed by organic or sociological laws. It is constituted and held together neither by biological nor by testamentary inheritance, but through the insight that all binds, and even guarantees only its present, not future community. Though it might bear the seal of all logical criteria, it nonetheless lacks the confirmation that only victory brings. It will lack the confirmation of victory until our epoch is finally brought to an end. Until then, too, the struggle to grasp and apply it rightly continues. The kind of theory that has the apparatus of propaganda and the majority on its side is not that the reason alone that better. Before a universal historical upheaval, truth can indeed reside in a small number of small groups. History teaches that such groups, hardly noticed even by their proposition, ostracized but unwaveringly can at the decisive moment become the vanguard, the tip of the spear, by virtue of their depth of insight. Today, when the whole power of the existing order urges surrender of all cultural values and drives onwards towards the bleakest barbarism, the circle of true solidarity is already narrow enough. The lords and masters of this age of decline, adversaries of the theory, have neither loyalty nor solidarity. These concepts are moments of the right theory and the right practice. Once divorced from both, the significance of the concepts changes, as do all elements when separated from a living context. That something of a positive aspect of the human community can develop even within a band of robbers is true. However, this is an index of failing of a broader society within which the brand exists. For a society were perfectly just, its criminals would be inhuman. In an unjust society, however, they're by no means necessarily any less human for being criminals. They are. Individual judgments about what is or is not human only acquire proper meaning in the context. There are no general criteria for critical trans theory as a whole. Any criteria of this kind would have to rely on the repetition of events, and therefore the existence of a given self-reproducing totality. Nor is there any social class with whom the theory could always turn for approval. Under present-day social relations, the consciousness of every social stratum may be ideologically constricted and corrupted, no matter how much the social situation of its members might predispose them towards truth. No matter how keen the insight in each of its individual steps, and despite the agreement between its elements and those of the most progressive traditional theories, critical theory has no authority to arrogate to itself, besides the interest in abolition of class domination inherent to it. This negative formulation, expressed abstractly, is the materialist content of the idealist conception of concept of reason. In a historical period like ours, the true theory is not so much affirmative as it is critical. Actions taken in accordance with the theory cannot be called productive. Today, the future of humanity depends on the existence of critical bearing. Not only does it include elements from traditional theories, but draws its elements from all over this perishing culture as a whole. Once science, in its imagined self-sufficiency, conceives of shapes that social practice it serves, in which it belongs, is utterly beyond its remit and humbly defers to the separation of thinking and action, it has already renounced humanity, determining for itself what it should achieve, what it should serve, not just in the individual aspect, but in its totality. This is the distinguishing characteristic of the activity of thought. Its very composition drives it towards historical change. Beneath the loud roar of social spirit in Volksgemeinschaft, I think that means like something about the community of people or something, the opposition of individual and society deepens by the day. The self-determination of science becomes more and more abstract. The conformism of thinking, and the insistence it be an even more rigid profession, a self-contained realm inside the social whole, betrays the essence of thinking itself. Notes. Oh yeah, these are my notes on the this last bit. There is unconscious fear that the theoretical thinking might expose adaptation to reality as wrong and necessary, but humanity will have to constitute itself for the first time as a conscious subject. The critical theorist society as a whole is a single unfolding existential judgment, itself a totality. Capitalism contains internal contradictions leading to crisis, ultimately holds back all further development, and drives humanity into a new barbarism. See my audiobook for Onward Barbarians by Bordiga. Contradictions emerge from the fact that the object of the theory itself changes in history. Under monopoly, capitalism, cliques of industrial and political leadership rule society. The individual no longer has any thought of their own, only existing as the immediate product of the ruling bureaucracies. Yeah, this is very important. Truth has retreated into exceptional, small groups decimated by under the terror. Listen, what do you think about Stalinist Russia? Okay, modern America makes Stalinist Russia looks libertarian. Okay, they didn't have the surveillance state that we have now. Critical theory has no authority besides the interest in abolition of class domination inherent to it. There is no social class to whom the theory could always turn for approval. Truth can indeed reside in a small number of small groups. Once science defers to the separation of thinking and action, it has already renounced humanity. The true theory is not so much affirmative as it is critical. Thank you. That was Traditional Critical Theory by Horkheimer. It's really good and really really relevant, because I think it kind of gets into what should someone, as someone making a critical analysis of society, what should they be doing? I think it kind of tries to address that conundrum. I think it tries to address the question of, what exactly is critical theory, what separates it, and what exactly should a critical theorist do, And the answer I take away is they should acknowledge that, society must be reformulated in a different way, ultimately. And, and they should, you shouldn't fall into, trying to find, some sort of fake middle ground. You should be making a ruthless criticism of all that exists, You should be, I think you should be trying to, change the world, Change, my final message, change the world. Goodbye.